Welcome to Poetic Lines, where writers make the language sing. Today my guest is Sander Zulauf, a teacher, editor, and lifelong New Jersey resident who believes that poetry should leave people filled with joy and excitement. Sander has taught writing and literature for 43 years at County College of Morris, and for several years before that, he taught in the public schools of Paterson, one of the most economically challenged cities in the state. Sander's poetry is vibrant and vital, whether he's describing the rich melting pot one sees along the Jersey shoreline or writing about his favorite vacation spot. He looks for color and brightness, lightness and beauty, and always tries to make something unusual happen in his writing. Sander is a Dodge poet, the founding editor of the Index of American Periodical Verse, and one of the editors of the Poets of New Jersey, From Colonial to Contemporary, which was published in 2005. He was named the first poet laureate of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark in 1999, an honor he cherishes since spirituality is an important part of his life and work. Sander's 4 books of poetry include a collection of haiku inspired by Basho, nature, and the beauty of Lake George. He is married to the photographer Madeline Zulauf, whom he met after having a life-changing encounter with his favorite poet, James Wright. I'm delighted that Sander has joined us here today to talk about finding light, even when the world seems very dark.
Thank you, Elizabeth, very much. I am happy to be here with you at HCAM. I'd like to start by reading one of these spiritually informed poems from this little chapbook called Living Waters, which I published as a project as poet laureate. And the poem is called List of Things to Do, which I guess most of us make every day. And it starts with an epigraph from Luke. Martha, Martha, you are fretting and fussing about so many things. Does the sun fret and fuss as it softly lights the east room of your life in the morning? Or the moon, the full moon, shedding its light across still waters, does it fret and fuss? That morning glory, opening silently and being full of grace until it folds in prayer at noon upon its glowing center. Even then, its glory done, does it fret and fuss? And you, as you sit there, writing or reading, watching or listening, are you focused on all that you are about, or do you fret and fuss, missing the only thing necessary for your one certain, fleeting, natural life?
Thank you. That is a beautiful poem. And as you were reading, my first thought was, ooh, I'm kind of a Martha sometimes, probably more often than I would like to admit. And the second thought was, what does he mean by that wonderful ending? Do you fret and fuss, missing the only thing necessary for your one certain fleeting natural life? What is the only thing necessary?
I think that's up to each individual to figure out, that essential thing. For me, it's living in the spirit and remembering that we're not here by accident. Nothing is here by accident. We're all here for a purpose, and I suppose that's what I mean.
When you and I were chatting before we came into the studio, you also mentioned that it's often a question of focus for people. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it's very difficult in this day and age to be focused. I mean, any classroom I go into now, I'm competing with smartphones and thumbs and text messages and all sorts of things. And I think our our attention span has shriveled in the past 10 or 15 years, and we're being bombarded with images all the time, news, you know, and it's happening faster and faster, and we don't really have time to process it. And so I think our focus is kind of more like a kaleidoscope than a focus.
That's very true. And yet poetry almost compels people to focus, to slow down and be in that moment.
Exactly. Well, that's part of I think that's part of the job of a good poem, to take you out of the chaos and lead you to a place that's a little bit more comfortable, or maybe uncomfortable, but purposeful.
When you're introducing poetry to your students, or you're getting them to write poems of their own, how do they react once they realize where poetry can take them?
They usually end up screaming and kicking that they have to write a poem, and for some of them it's a life changer, and for others it's an assignment that has to be fulfilled. And the ones whose lives are changed end up doing remarkable things. For example, one of my 8th grade students in Patterson is now a doctor named Hector Castillo, who ran for governor 2 times in New Jersey. A remarkable story out of, you know, economic deprivation to rise to that level and be a successful doctor. So poetry can change lives. One of my students wrote a novel and dedicated it to me. I thought that was really stunning. I quickly asked her, wasn't there a family member she could dedicate it to? And she cheekily said, to Sandra Zulauf, who ruined my life. That was the dedication.
Well, what you're really getting at is the way that poetry allows people to see possibilities in a moment, in something that a poet is writing about, or even in their own lives. And sometimes just that one moment can really become a doorway for people.
Right. You mentioned James Wright, and that was actually in 1971, and I was so moved by his reading at Indiana University that I wanted to find out if there were any poets in America who were doing such extraordinary work. And that started me on the quest of the Index of American Periodical Verse, and Wright remained, you know, far superior. He influenced so many poets. I mean, thousands of poets are influenced by James Wright, and of course he and his son Franz are the only father and son who ever received the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. But it was his poem of blessing that moved me so that day in Indiana.
That poem and his work opened possibilities for you.
Exactly.
What did they show you that you could do, or that poetry could help you do?
Actually, it made me feel like, well, I know Harold Bloom has his theory of influence, you know, the anxiety of influence, and I think, you know, when I saw how good Wright could do it, I felt like this is an exercise in futility, you know, but I still feel that it was necessary to keep trying, and some, you know, publications started to happen, and I was very thrilled with that.
Well, I love what you said about looking for color and brightness, lightness and beauty in your work, and always trying to make something unusual happen. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, you know, it's, what did Eliot say? No, it was Frost. Frost said, poetry begins in delight and ends in wisdom. And it's that metaphysical kick at the end of a poem that can, you know, as the end of James writes, a blessing. That poem has that metaphysical ending that takes you somewhere, you know, unusually brilliant. And he's a master. And there were so many in that generation of poets that were incredible. And they're all passing on now. It's just quite astonishing to me that we're losing so many of them, like Phil Levine and Mark Strand and Carolyn Kaiser and Maxine Kumin. And, you know, extraordinary generation of poets. Kind of, they really dominated the poetry scene here for a long, long time, and they kept practicing their art, which is something as a community college teacher I find very difficult to do. At the end of the day, there's not much left.
But you had one incredible summer where you worked on a book that really gave you a renewed sense of life. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. This is my new little chapbook called Basho in America. And I guess I can hold it up to the camera. And it has a photograph by my wife, Madeline. This is Lake George. A calligraphy by my friend, the Japanese scholar, Sandy Heinlein, which says Matsuo Basho. And this is Glen Island on Lake George. And you can see it's the ranger station. And if you look very carefully, the American flag is there. And this is Black Mountain, and this is Lake George. And I spent the week on an island, a cabin in the lake, writing 4 hours a day and reading and living life of a poet and imagining Basho in his cabin and Thoreau in his cabin and living like a writer. And I was having more fun than should be legal, I think.
What made you decide that you needed to bring him to Lake George?
When I went on the internet, I originally planned to go to Japan, but I don't know Japanese, and I figured that would be a pretty difficult trip. And I went on the internet and saw that Lake Biwa, which is where Basho had his abode of illusion in the 17th century, his students built him this cabin on the lake. I said, gee, that looks a lot like Lake George, which is my favorite place on the planet. And I said, well, instead of me going to Japan, I'll invite Basho, who died in the 1690s. I'll invite him to come to Lake George. And he did. It was wonderful. We spent the mornings writing poetry together.
What was it about the haiku form that really gave you a lot of freedom as a writer?
Well, I've always felt that the process of poetry is compression and trying to get it exactly right in language. And having this haiku form, of course, when it was Englished, they decided 5 syllables in the first line, 7 in the second line, 5 syllables in the third line. So you have to make something happen in 17 syllables. And I felt, well, this is poetry for the age of Twitter. And I found that the compression and that form created a great deal of freedom, having to pick the exactly right word, and then suddenly realizing, well, I don't even need to stick to the 5-7-5. If the exactly right word has an extra syllable, I'm going to use the exactly right word anyway. I'm not going to be trapped by that form, but the form, ironically, you think it's structured and limiting, but it's very freeing. That's one of the most unusual things. The haiku traditionally has a word called a kigo, which is a season word, so that they try to place a season into every little haiku so that you know seasonally where you are. And I more or less followed that. I mean, you could figure out from some of the images what season it is. And they kind of flow all through this book. Sometimes, since I was there in September, I had to imagine winter on the islands, and so I didn't witness winter, but then I figured nobody does because they're icebound.
Mm-hmm. What I love about the book is the fact that there are 3 haiku on each page, and there's a real sense of movement among the poems and then from page to page as well. Would you read us the 3 haiku on page 16?
The 3 haiku on page 16, sure. The traditional way to read haiku is to read them twice, but we don't have enough time for that, so I'll just read them once and read them slowly. Full harvest moon rises above Black Mountain, lighting pine islands. How many rain clouds ascended and descended these green mountainsides? Last of summer's sun, taking the long days with it into Autumn Lake.
I love the fact that those poems are so visual, and you do have the seasonal element, and yet there's something more, something that you can't quite articulate.
Well, that's part of what I was trying to accomplish. These things they pretty much mean what they say, which is unusual for poetry. Mm-hmm. Most people try to look profound. I'm not trying to look profound. I'm trying to look happy, and just share the joy that it was to be there, to be writing these poems at that beautiful place. I'll try these 3. Last night she scrubbed up 3 potatoes for dinner. This song is for her. Pine Island perfume clings to the cicada's song like hot summer sun. Lying down one summer, adrift in my canoe, reading Brave New World.
I like the progression there because it goes from love of someone who is very important to you to the idea of reading about a brave new world. And in doing so, you sort of give permission to readers to take their own brave journey.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. When we were talking the other day on the phone, you made this comment that I love. You said, "We don't dream enough in the daytime." And then you talked about Thoreau and how he lived his dream. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of dreaming in the daytime?
Unfortunately, I don't do enough of it. It's all kind of, we are driven people, and that's why this week was so glorious, because I was doing an awful lot of dreaming and having a great time. Dreaming is kind of essential. Just like as I age, I think, a nap is a wonderful idea. I don't do that either yet. Some people pointed out that there are an awful lot of bugs in this book, spiders and cicadas and katydids and crickets and daddy longlegs. But I wanted to just, show the essential interconnection between all living things, and one of the things up at Lake George is this bird. My mother, may she rest in peace, called the Lake George bird, and I found out years later it was the eastern pewee, and that bird's song goes something like this. And that gave rise to these poems. Early morning rain, the eastern pewee's cry floats between islands. That plaintive mercy, listen, there, do you hear it? Sympathetic song.
So what you just read makes me think of something you said when we were talking earlier. And you were talking about what it means to be a witness. You said that at least in that moment, for you it meant to be somebody on whom nothing is lost, take it all in, deal with what you can deal with, and pray for what you can't.
I stand by that comment.
Mm-hmm. How important is it for you to be a witness in general and to be a witness to light specifically?
I'd say it's pretty essential. And it's being a witness in a way that you want to make something that's more permanent than a letter to the editor of the New York Times complaining about the price of butter. And so I guess that's why I became a poet. There's a quotation in here from Basho, Sam Hamill. And I'd say that this book is unusual because it mixes prose and the poems together with some quotations from Basho and some quotations from Sam Hamill's wonderful book, Narrow Road to the Interior. Basho was struggling to achieve a resonance between the fleeting moment and the eternal, between the instant of awareness and the vast emptiness of Zen. Mm. And I think that is kind of a summary statement about what I'm attempting in these haiku.
Mm-hmm. That makes me think about the relationship between the timeless and the temporal, which makes me think of the readings that you organized as Poet Laureate. Tell us a little bit about those.
I invited some really distinguished poets from New Jersey to join me in a reading in Grace Church in Newark. And it was on a rainy, rainy, cold December night. And the idea was to bring groceries to the church for the food pantry, and that was the admission for the reading. So we had about half a dozen poets there that night, and 20 bags of groceries were brought to the food pantry by the people who came to listen.
Mm-hmm. In a way, you were reinforcing the idea that you can't just live by bread alone, that words are important.
Well, they do matter. They certainly do matter. And I was reading this morning, I thought Howard Nemerov said it, but it turns out that Mark Twain said it. The difference between the right word and the exactly right word is the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm so interested in shooting for the exactly right word, so to make Twain proud.
Mm. Do your students eventually come to the point where they see how important words are?
Some do. You can't reach everybody, and you'd probably be really frustrated trying, but you do the best you can. And those students reach out to me years later with some astonishing news. And it's always gratifying to find out that they did so well, or that they're now, in a PhD English program because of taking composition with me, or creative writing, or in an MFA program somewhere because they first encountered it here and with me, and that's you can't do better than that.
That's very true. You are a proud New Jersey poet. And you told me something of what it's like to be part of the New Jersey melting pot. Would you tell us about that?
Yeah, New Jersey used to be a rural place. When I was a kid growing up, I'd go visit Tommy the Bull in a pasture in my town, which was only 14 miles west of Newark, but it was rural back then. And now, there's just sprawl everywhere, and New Jersey has the distinction of being more populous per square mile than India, and there's something like 70 different languages spoken in New Jersey, so it's retained its melting pot status from the very beginning to the current day. It just is an amazing place to live, and by growing up with so many different cultures, cultural barriers are broken down and people come together. And That's what makes New Jersey special.
Believe it or not, we are almost out of time. So would you close with one more poem?
Okay, I would be happy to. It's, you know, the wakes in the lake break on the granite shores of the islands, and they make this crashing sound. And the last poem in the book is this: now all wakes that break along this rocky shore are saying peace, peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing your peace and light and those beautiful poems.
It's a pleasure. Happy to be here.
Features share their art, followed by an open mic with people who come from near and far.
Think Jackson Pollock in monochromatic brown.
When the owls finally roost and small creatures can safely sleep, I can sleep too.
I sang with the master and danced for eternity in the light of the moon.
Then there's me.
Just a minute, folks.
It's Dive-In Drive-In time, and we got a great Western for you today.
Dive-In Drive-In is a new program featuring the HCAM staff's favorite B movies. We hope you'll enjoy these treasured films of yesteryear.
And even if we don't get paid, there ain't no job we trade. We're hauling freight and safe to say no longer Santa Fe.
So check out the HCAM TV website at hcam.tv for movies.